In the early months of World War II, the Pacific War was collapsing faster than anyone in Washington had expected. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed. Hong Kong had fallen, Singapore had surrendered, and the American stronghold in the Philippines was slowly being strangled. For the soldiers stationed there, every day brought worse news than the last. By May of 1942, the situation on the island of Mindanao was hopeless. Supplies were gone, ammunition was running out, communication with the outside world had nearly disappeared. The once organized American and Filipino defensive forces had been shattered by months of relentless attacks. What remained were scattered units, exhausted officers, and thousands of soldiers who knew the end was approaching. On May 10th, something extraordinary happened, but it wasn't a battle. Nearly 78,000 American and Filipino troops were ordered to surrender to the Japanese army. The decision had already been made by the High Command after the devastating losses at Battle of Bataan and Battle of Corregidor. The message was clear: resistance was finished. The war in the Philippines was over. One long column of defeated soldiers began moving toward Japanese prison camps. Among the officers watching this moment was a 41-year-old American mining engineer named Wendell Fertig. Just a few years earlier, he had been working civilian engineering jobs in Southeast Asia. He wasn't a career soldier, he wasn't famous, and at that moment he commanded almost nothing. But as he watched the long line of prisoners march away, Fertig realized something that most others didn't. Once they entered those camps, the war for them would be finished, and for many of them, survival itself would become the real battle. The Japanese prison camps in the Pacific were brutal places. Food was scarce, medical care was almost non-existent. Prisoners were often forced into exhausting labor under harsh guards. News from the outside world rarely reached them, and escape was nearly impossible. For most soldiers on Mindanao that day, surrender felt like the only remaining option. But Fertig wasn't convinced. Instead of joining the columns of prisoners, he made a quiet decision that would change the course of the war on the island. He walked into the jungle. At the time, it looked like madness. He had no army, no radio, no supply lines, no clear plan. Japanese patrols were already spreading across the island, hunting down any soldiers who had avoided surrender. Any American officer caught hiding in the jungle could expect immediate execution. Still, Fertig disappeared into the dense mountains of Mindanao. Mindanao was not an easy place to survive. Thick jungle covered the hills and valleys. Rivers cut through deep ravines. Tropical storms could arrive without warning. The heat was relentless, and diseases like malaria and dysentery were constant threats. Even experienced soldiers struggled in that environment. Yet somewhere in that jungle, Fertig began doing something almost impossible. He started looking for survivors. Not prisoners, not refugees, soldiers. Across the island, small groups of American and Filipino troops had also avoided surrender. Some had hidden in villages, others had fled deep into the mountains. Many had lost their commanders and were simply trying to stay alive. Fertig slowly began gathering them. Sometimes it was only 2 or 3 men at a time. Occasionally a full squad would appear out of the jungle. Filipino soldiers who knew the terrain far better than any American joined the scattered groups as well. But gathering men was only the first challenge. The real problem was authority. In 1942, the American command structure in the Philippines had effectively vanished. Officers had been captured, communications had collapsed, and no one knew who was actually in charge anymore. Without clear leadership, any resistance movement could easily fall apart. Fertig understood this immediately. If he wanted to organize a real resistance, he needed to convince everyone that a functioning command structure still existed. So he did something that sounded unbelievable. He promoted himself. Using a pair of silver stars made from coins, Fertig declared himself a brigadier general of the United States Army. To many people, it seemed absurd. He had no official authorization, no orders from Washington, no confirmation from any surviving headquarters. From the outside, it looked like a desperate man inventing rank in the middle of the jungle. But inside the chaos of occupied Mindanao, that simple decision had a powerful effect. Soldiers who had been wandering without direction suddenly had a general again. Filipino fighters who wanted to resist Japanese rule now had an American officer who claimed to represent the continuing war effort. Even local village leaders began hearing rumors that an American general was still fighting in the mountains. Slowly, a legend began to spread. Some said he commanded thousands of hidden troops. Others believed he had secret supply lines from Australia. A few even thought he had direct contact with General Douglas MacArthur himself. In reality, none of those things were true. At least, not yet. At the beginning, Fertig's entire army consisted of a few scattered groups with mismatched rifles, almost no ammunition, and no reliable way to communicate across the island. Some weapons were leftovers from earlier battles. Others had been hidden by soldiers who refused to surrender. Food was another problem entirely. The jungle could provide some supplies, wild plants, fish, occasional hunting, but feeding even a small group of fighters required cooperation with local villages. The Filipino population had already begun suffering under Japanese occupation, and helping American guerrillas could bring severe punishment. Yet many villages quietly chose to help. They provided food, information, and guides who knew the complicated network of jungle trails. In return, Fertig promised something that many people desperately wanted to believe. The war was not over. Meanwhile, the Japanese command on Mindanao believed they had already secured the island. Their focus was shifting toward other battlefronts across the Pacific. But reports soon began reaching their headquarters. American soldiers had been seen in the mountains. Japanese patrols occasionally vanished while searching remote valleys. A supply convoy might be ambushed along a jungle road and disappear without explanation. Villagers sometimes refused to cooperate with occupation forces. At first, Japanese officers assumed these were isolated incidents, but slowly a disturbing pattern began to appear. Someone was organizing resistance, and rumors kept mentioning the same thing: an American general in the jungle. Back in Australia, the headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur was beginning to hear similar stories through intelligence channels. Strange reports described a guerrilla leader on Mindanao claiming to command thousands of fighters and still representing the United States Army. At first, many officers in MacArthur's staff dismissed the story. It sounded too strange to be real. One staff officer reportedly suggested that it might even be a Japanese trick, a trap designed to lure Allied submarines or agents into dangerous territory. After all, how could a single officer build an army in the middle of an occupied island with no supplies, no communication, and tens of thousands of enemy troops searching for him? Yet the reports kept coming. Messages passed secretly through Filipino fishermen, notes carried by risky submarine missions, fragments of intelligence gathered from local resistance contacts. All of them pointed to the same name: Wendell Fertig. By the middle of 1942, the island of Mindanao was officially under Japanese control. Their flags flew above government buildings, their patrols moved along the main roads, and their officers believed the island had already been pacified. To them, the surrender of tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers meant the war in the southern Philippines was finished. But far from the towns and military garrisons, deep inside the jungle-covered mountains, something very different was happening. The man responsible for it was still the same unlikely figure who had refused to surrender months earlier: Wendell Fertig. At the beginning, Fertig had only a handful of followers: scattered soldiers who had escaped capture, a few Filipino officers who refused to accept defeat, small groups hiding in remote valleys, unsure whether the war had truly ended. But Fertig understood something important about human nature in wartime. People needed leadership, even more than weapons. Without it, fear and confusion would slowly break any resistance movement apart. Soldiers would eventually surrender or try to disappear back into civilian life. Villages would stop helping them, and the Japanese occupation would become permanent. So Fertig leaned completely into the role he had created for himself. He was no longer simply a lieutenant colonel hiding in the jungle. He was now a brigadier general. The decision to promote himself had been risky, even absurd on paper, but inside the chaotic conditions of occupied Mindanao, it worked. Rank mattered to soldiers. Authority mattered to local leaders. When Fertig arrived wearing the stars of a general, people listened. And slowly, the rumors began spreading further across the island. Some said an American general had refused to surrender and was preparing a new army. Others claimed he had already organized thousands of guerrillas hiding in the mountains. In villages where news traveled mostly by word of mouth, the story grew larger each time it was repeated. In truth, Fertig's forces were still fragile and scattered, but he knew that perception could be just as powerful as reality. When Filipino officers arrived to meet him, they expected to see a man with a plan. Fertig gave them one. He spoke with confidence about rebuilding the resistance and restoring American command on the island. He issued orders, appointed officers, and began organizing the scattered fighters into actual units. It was the beginning of something that looked like a real army. One of Fertig's first priorities was solving the problem of unity. Mindanao was not a simple place politically or culturally. The island was home to many different groups: Christian Filipinos, Muslim communities, tribal groups living in remote mountains, and some of them had old rivalries that went back generations. In peacetime, those rivalries might have continued forever, but the Japanese occupation changed everything. Fertig began meeting with local leaders, sometimes traveling for days through jungle trails just to speak with one influential village chief. Instead of treating them as subordinates, he treated them as allies. He explained that the war was far from over and that the United States would eventually return. The question was simple: would Mindanao be ready when that day came? For many communities, the answer became yes. Filipino guerrilla leaders began bringing their own fighters into Fertig's growing network. Some groups had only a dozen men, others had several hundred. They were poorly equipped but deeply motivated. Many had already witnessed the harsh realities of Japanese occupation: forced labor, food seizures, and brutal punishments for suspected resistance. Joining the guerrillas meant risking everything, but it also meant fighting back. Meanwhile, the Japanese occupation authorities were slowly becoming aware that something was wrong. Patrol reports described strange encounters in the mountains. Soldiers occasionally came under fire from hidden positions along jungle trails. Some patrols disappeared entirely. At first, Japanese officers believed these were just isolated bands of desperate survivors, but the attacks kept happening, and they were becoming more organized. The guerrillas rarely fought large battles. Instead, they used the terrain of Mindanao to their advantage. Narrow jungle paths became perfect ambush points. Small Japanese supply convoys traveling between garrisons suddenly found themselves under fire from unseen shooters in the trees. Then, the attackers would disappear back into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. For the Japanese soldiers, it was a frustrating and confusing enemy. They rarely saw the same fighters twice, but every successful ambush had an important effect beyond the battlefield. Each attack strengthened the legend of the mysterious American general leading the resistance. Villagers who heard about these operations became more willing to help the guerrillas with food, shelter, and information. Information was perhaps the most valuable resource of all. Local fishermen reported Japanese naval movements along the coast. Farmers noticed when new garrisons were established near their villages. Traders traveling between towns overheard conversations from Japanese officers who assumed civilians couldn't understand their language. Piece by piece, a network of intelligence began forming across Mindanao. But there was still one enormous problem. Fertig's growing resistance army had no way to communicate with the outside world. Since the surrender in 1942, the Philippines had been cut off from Allied command. The closest friendly headquarters was now nearly 2,000 miles away in Australia, where General Douglas MacArthur was rebuilding American forces for a future return to the Philippines. Fertig knew that if he could somehow establish radio contact with MacArthur's headquarters, everything would change. Supplies might eventually arrive, submarines could deliver weapons, intelligence from Mindanao could help Allied planners prepare for future operations in the Pacific. But building a functioning radio station inside a jungle resistance movement was incredibly difficult. Most military radios had been destroyed or captured during the Japanese invasion. Spare parts were almost impossible to find. Even if a transmitter could be assembled, it would need power, trained operators, and secure locations to avoid Japanese detection. Still, Fertig refused to give up on the idea. He began searching the island for engineers, technicians, and radio enthusiasts who had avoided capture. Some were former military signal operators, others were civilian radio enthusiasts who once worked on commercial equipment. Together, they began experimenting with whatever materials they could find. Old electrical parts were scavenged from abandoned buildings, wires were pulled from damaged telegraph lines, batteries were rebuilt using improvised chemical solutions. Some components had to be constructed entirely from scrap metal. It was slow, frustrating work, but every step brought them closer to something that seemed impossible just months earlier, a working radio network hidden inside the jungle. Meanwhile, Fertig continued expanding his growing resistance army. New fighters kept arriving from remote villages and mountain settlements. Filipino officers who had initially been skeptical about the self-appointed American general were beginning to change their opinions. Despite the lack of resources, the resistance movement was growing stronger instead of weaker. More units meant more patrols. More patrols meant more attacks on Japanese supply lines, and every attack forced the occupation forces to spread themselves thinner across the island. Japanese commanders soon realized they were facing something much larger than a few scattered survivors. Somewhere on Mindanao, a coordinated resistance movement was forming, and the man leading it had already made a promise that few people outside the jungle believed. The war in the Philippines was not over. It had only changed shape.
By early 1943, something extraordinary was taking shape in the jungles and mountains of Mindanao. What had begun as a scattered collection of survivors hiding from Japanese patrols was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous, a real guerrilla army. The man guiding this transformation was still the unlikely leader who had refused to surrender months earlier, Wendell Fertig. From the outside, the Japanese occupation authorities believed they controlled Mindanao. Their troops held the major towns, ports, and airfields. Their flags flew over government buildings. On official maps, the island appeared firmly under Japanese rule. But those maps hid a growing reality. Large parts of the interior were slipping out of their control. Across forests, mountain valleys, and remote coastal regions, small guerrilla units loyal to Fertig were beginning to operate more openly. They rarely gathered in large formations, but their presence was everywhere. Patrols watched jungle roads, scouts monitored Japanese garrisons. Messengers moved constantly between villages carrying orders and intelligence. The resistance movement was no longer just surviving, it was organizing. Fertig understood that if his guerrilla army was going to last, it needed more than courage and improvisation. It needed structure. Soldiers had to know who their commanders were. Units needed defined territories. Supplies had to be tracked and distributed carefully. So he began building something that looked remarkably similar to a conventional military organization. Different regions of Mindanao were divided into operational zones. Filipino officers who had previously served in the Philippine Army were given command responsibilities. Each zone reported information through a growing network of couriers and runners who traveled along hidden jungle routes. This system allowed Fertig to maintain control over forces that were often separated by dozens or even hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. At the same time, the number of fighters continued growing. Some recruits were former soldiers who had escaped Japanese prison camps. Others were civilians who had decided that life under occupation was unbearable. Young men from farming villages, fishermen from coastal communities, and tribal warriors from remote mountain regions all joined the resistance. Many arrived carrying whatever weapons they could find. Some had old American rifles left behind after the surrender of 1942. Others carried hunting guns, pistols, or even machetes. Ammunition was often scarce. In many cases, a fighter might only have a handful of bullets. For a conventional army, this would have been a disaster. For a guerrilla movement, it was simply another challenge. Fertig encouraged his men to think creatively. If weapons were scarce, they would make their own. Improvised workshops began appearing in hidden jungle camps. Metal workers and mechanics experimented with whatever materials they could gather. Curtain rods were cut and reshaped into crude gun barrels. Old pipes were turned into mortars. Iron fences were melted down and reformed into parts for weapons or tools. Even telegraph wire scavenged from abandoned lines became valuable material. None of it looked impressive, but it worked. Ammunition presented another problem. Factories were obviously impossible to build in the jungle, but the guerrillas found ways to reuse materials from unexploded ordnance or damaged ammunition recovered from earlier battlefields. Every bullet was treated like treasure. When the guerrillas launched attacks, they did so carefully. Ambushes were planned to maximize surprise and minimize wasted ammunition. Fighters were trained to fire only when targets were clear and escape routes were secure. The goal was not large battles. The goal was pressure. Japanese patrols moving through the countryside could never feel safe. Supply convoys traveling between garrisons had to watch every bend in the road. Even simple movements through the mountains became slow and cautious operations. The guerrillas rarely stayed in one place long enough for the Japanese to locate them. They appeared suddenly, struck quickly, and vanished back into the jungle. But perhaps the most remarkable development was something far less visible than these attacks. Fertig was building a functioning government inside occupied territory. In areas where Japanese forces rarely traveled, local communities began operating under the protection of the guerrillas. Village leaders organized food production, medical aid, and basic law enforcement. Courts were sometimes established to resolve disputes or punish collaborators who assisted the occupation forces. Taxes were occasionally collected in the form of rice or livestock to support the growing guerrilla army. It was an unusual situation. On paper, Japan controlled Mindanao. In reality, entire regions were quietly governed by a resistance movement. Still, the most important breakthrough came from a project that had begun months earlier, the effort to build a radio capable of reaching Allied forces. Since the fall of the Philippines in 1942, the islands had been almost completely isolated from the outside world. Without communication, the guerrillas could not coordinate with Allied strategy. They could not request supplies, and they had no way of proving that their growing army even existed. For a long time, many officers at Allied headquarters believed the Philippines had gone silent. But inside a hidden jungle camp, a group of technicians working for Fertig continued experimenting with salvaged radio equipment. Old vacuum tubes were carefully repaired, antennas were constructed from long strands of salvaged wire, generators were improvised with mechanical parts taken from abandoned machinery. The work required patience, skill, and a great deal of luck. Then, one night, something incredible happened. The signal finally reached across the Pacific. For the first time since the surrender of the Philippines, a guerrilla transmitter from Mindanao successfully contacted Allied forces. Thousands of miles away in Australia, operators working under the command of Douglas MacArthur heard the message. At first, they weren't sure what they were hearing. The voice on the radio claimed that a large resistance movement was operating on Mindanao under the command of an American brigadier general named Wendell Fertig. The message described thousands of fighters, organized zones of control, and ongoing attacks against Japanese occupation forces. Some officers at headquarters were skeptical. The story sounded almost unbelievable. An entire guerrilla army surviving inside Japanese territory for more than a year? A self-promoted general commanding tens of thousands of fighters? It seemed possible that the signal was a trap or misinformation. But the messages continued. More detailed reports followed. Intelligence about Japanese troop movements, descriptions of airfields, supply depots, and shipping routes. Information that could only come from someone observing the occupation closely. Slowly, the doubts began fading. The resistance on Mindanao was real, and it was far larger than anyone had expected. For Fertig and his guerrilla army, the successful radio contact changed everything. They were no longer completely isolated. Their reports were reaching Allied planners. Their existence was finally acknowledged by the outside world. Yet the radio connection also brought a new danger. If the Japanese discovered the transmitter, they would launch massive operations to destroy it. Because by now, the occupation authorities were beginning to realize something alarming. The resistance movement on Mindanao was not shrinking, it was growing. Estimates suggested that Fertig's guerrilla network might already include tens of thousands of fighters and supporters scattered across the island. Japanese patrols reported ambushes in areas that had once been considered secure. Entire mountain regions had effectively become forbidden territory for occupation forces. For Japanese commanders, this was unacceptable. An organized enemy army operating behind their lines could not be tolerated. Plans were soon drawn up for large-scale operations to hunt down the mysterious American general and crush his resistance once and for all. Somewhere in the mountains of Mindanao, Wendell Fertig was building something the Japanese had not expected, an army that refused to disappear. And now that army was finally being heard across the Pacific.
By the middle of 1943, the situation on Mindanao had become deeply troubling for the Japanese occupation forces. What they had once believed was a quiet, conquered island was now turning into a constant source of disruption. Patrols were being ambushed, supply routes were repeatedly attacked, intelligence reports spoke of an organized resistance movement operating across large areas of the island, and at the center of all these reports was the same name that had begun appearing again and again: Wendell Fertig. For more than a year, Japanese commanders had assumed the resistance consisted of scattered survivors hiding in the mountains, but new information suggested something far more serious. Interrogations of captured villagers, intercepted messages, and battlefield encounters were painting a disturbing picture. There was not just a small band of rebels, there was an organized army. Some estimates suggested that Fertig's network of fighters and supporters might number in the tens of thousands. Guerrilla units appeared in multiple regions of Mindanao, often coordinating attacks on Japanese patrols or supply convoys. For an occupying army, this kind of resistance was dangerous. Every convoy now required additional guards. Every patrol had to move slowly and cautiously through terrain that could hide enemies at any moment. Even small garrisons in remote towns began requesting reinforcements. The Japanese command decided it was time to eliminate the problem completely. Large-scale operations were planned to sweep through the mountains and jungle regions where guerrillas were believed to be hiding. Thousands of soldiers were assigned to the mission. Their goal was simple: find the resistance camps, destroy them, and capture the mysterious American general who had become a symbol of defiance on the island. For the guerrillas, the coming offensive was a serious threat. Unlike small patrols, these large operations involved entire units moving through the countryside, searching villages, burning suspected hideouts, and interrogating civilians. The Japanese forces hoped that by applying enough pressure, they could break the resistance network or force someone to reveal Fertig's location. But the jungle of Mindanao was not an easy place for large armies to operate. Thick vegetation limited visibility to just a few meters in many places. Steep mountains slowed movement. Narrow trails made it difficult for soldiers to travel in large groups, and the guerrillas knew every hidden path, river crossing, and valley. As Japanese troops pushed deeper into the mountains, the resistance fighters adapted. Instead of confronting the advancing forces directly, they simply disappeared. Entire guerrilla camps could be dismantled within hours. Supplies were hidden or moved deeper into the jungle. Fighters scattered into smaller groups that were almost impossible to track. When Japanese soldiers arrived at suspected locations, they often found nothing but abandoned cooking fires and empty shelters. Yet the danger remained very real. Villages suspected of helping the guerrillas were often punished. Houses were burned, civilians were interrogated or beaten for information. Some prisoners were tortured in attempts to discover the locations of resistance leaders. For the people of Mindanao, the cost of supporting the guerrillas could be terrifying. Still, many communities continued helping. They warned guerrilla units when Japanese troops were approaching. Farmers hid supplies for fighters moving through the countryside. Fishermen along the coast quietly passed along information about Japanese ship movements. The resistance network depended heavily on these civilian connections. And despite the pressure from Japanese offensives, Fertig's organization continued to survive. Part of the reason was mobility. Unlike a conventional army, the guerrillas did not defend fixed positions. Their camps were temporary and often hidden in places difficult for large forces to reach. Fighters could move through jungle trails at night, traveling long distances without leaving obvious tracks. But another key advantage was information. Because of their civilian supporters, the guerrillas often knew about Japanese operations before they even began. When occupation forces started preparing a new sweep through the mountains, word could travel through villages and scouts long before the soldiers arrived. This allowed Fertig's units to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. Instead, they waited for moments when Japanese forces were vulnerable. Supply trucks traveling narrow jungle roads became prime targets. Small patrols separated from larger units sometimes walked straight into ambushes. Bridges were sabotaged, communication lines were cut. Even isolated outposts occasionally found themselves under sudden attack during the night. These operations rarely involved large numbers of fighters, but their psychological impact was enormous. Japanese soldiers could never be certain where the enemy might appear. A quiet jungle trail could suddenly erupt in gunfire. A routine convoy could vanish around a mountain bend and never return. Over time, the occupation forces began devoting more and more troops to security duties. Thousands of soldiers who might have been used in other parts of the Pacific War were now tied down trying to control a single island. Meanwhile, another development was quietly strengthening the resistance movement. Through their secret radio network, Fertig's forces had begun communicating regularly with Allied headquarters. Reports about Japanese troop movements, airfields, and supply depots were transmitted across the ocean. These messages eventually reached the command of Douglas MacArthur. For MacArthur, who had famously promised to return to the Philippines after being forced to leave in 1942, the information from Mindanao was extremely valuable. The guerrillas were providing intelligence from deep inside Japanese-controlled territory, and their reports suggested something remarkable. The resistance movement had grown into a powerful force. Estimates indicated that Fertig's network now included around 35,000 fighters and supporters across Mindanao. Not all of them were armed soldiers, but many were actively participating in intelligence gathering, supply operations, and sabotage missions. In effect, a hidden army had formed behind Japanese lines. For the Allies planning future operations in the Pacific, this could change everything. If the United States eventually launched an invasion to retake the Philippines, these guerrilla forces could provide local knowledge, disrupt Japanese defenses, and guide incoming troops through unfamiliar terrain. But that moment was still in the future. For now, the guerrillas faced a more immediate challenge. Japanese commanders had become obsessed with one objective: capturing the man they believed was responsible for the entire resistance movement. Wendell Fertig had become their primary target. His capture or death would be a major victory for the occupation forces. Japanese intelligence units began focusing specifically on locating his headquarters. Prisoners were questioned about his whereabouts. Patrols searched areas where he had been rumored to travel. But finding Fertig proved extremely difficult. He rarely stayed in one location for long. Meetings with commanders were held in remote camps that changed frequently. Messages were often delivered by trusted couriers rather than written orders. Even many guerrilla fighters had no idea exactly where their general might be at any given moment. This secrecy was intentional, because Fertig understood something very clearly. As long as he remained free in the mountains of Mindanao, the resistance would continue. And every day that the guerrilla army survived was another day the Japanese failed to fully control the island. The hunt for the American general would continue, but somewhere deep in the jungle, the army he had built from nothing was still growing stronger.
By late 1944, the tides of the Pacific War had begun to shift decisively. The Allies were advancing from island to island, retaking territories that had been lost in the early months of the conflict. Airstrips were being seized, ports were being reclaimed, and Japanese supply lines were increasingly disrupted. Yet for the campaign to succeed in the Philippines, detailed local knowledge was essential. That was where one remarkable force had been operating unseen for over 2 years, the guerrilla army of Wendell Fertig. Fertig's network had started as a few scattered soldiers hiding in the jungle, but over time it had grown into a formidable army numbering approximately 35,000 fighters and supporters. This was no ragtag band. It was an organized force with defined operational zones, intelligence networks, supply chains, and hidden camps scattered across the mountainous interior of Mindanao. For the Japanese, the island had never been fully under control, despite appearances. Fertig's army had carved out entire territories where Japanese soldiers dared not venture. From the beginning, Fertig understood that survival alone was not enough. The guerrillas needed to become a strategic instrument for the eventual Allied return. They began mapping Japanese troop positions, observing garrison movements, identifying supply routes, and even noting airfields and defensive positions. Every detail was painstakingly documented. Couriers risked their lives traversing hundreds of miles of jungle to deliver reports. Villagers and local guides served as the eyes and ears of the movement, providing invaluable intelligence that Allied commanders could never obtain through conventional reconnaissance. These intelligence efforts paid off in ways that would prove decisive. By the time General Douglas MacArthur began planning his return to the Philippines, he had a clear understanding of where Japanese forces were concentrated and where the guerrillas could provide support. Fertig's network essentially acted as an inside army, softening the island and laying the groundwork for liberation before the first Allied troops even landed. The guerrilla army was also critical in preparing the terrain itself. Fertig and his commanders established observation posts in mountain passes, cleared hidden jungle trails for rapid movement, and fortified positions where necessary to slow Japanese patrols. Villages loyal to the guerrillas were secured as staging points for upcoming operations. Hidden supplies of ammunition, food, and medical equipment were carefully cached so that when American forces arrived, they could move quickly without relying solely on long supply lines from afar. When Allied forces finally returned to Mindanao in late 1944, Fertig's preparations proved invaluable. His forces acted as guides through the dense jungle and mountainous terrain, helping American troops avoid natural hazards and ambush points. Guerrilla scouts moved ahead of the main units, observing enemy positions, marking obstacles, and occasionally engaging in sabotage operations. Bridges were destroyed, communication lines severed, and Japanese garrisons cut off from reinforcements. These operations caused chaos among Japanese commanders. They had long believed they controlled Mindanao, but now they were confronted by a well-coordinated internal resistance simultaneously with the invading Allied forces. The guerrillas were constantly mobile, striking at weak points and disappearing before retaliation could occur. The Japanese were forced to spread their troops thin, guarding supply lines and settlements that might otherwise have supported the main defensive effort. Beyond the tactical advantages, Fertig's army provided a critical morale boost. Filipino civilians who had endured years of occupation and terror saw American symbols and heard news that liberation was imminent. Villagers who had been quietly assisting guerrillas felt that their efforts had been justified, and more communities began supporting the resistance. Farmers, fishermen, and tribal leaders provided food, shelter, and intelligence, ensuring the guerrillas remained supplied and effective. The psychological impact of this support cannot be overstated. It created a sense of unity, purpose, and resilience that contrasted sharply with the fear imposed by the Japanese occupation. For Allied commanders, Fertig's work represented a game-changing advantage. The detailed intelligence allowed for precise planning of landings, troop movements, and attacks. Knowledge of Japanese defensive positions reduced the risk of ambushes and costly frontal assaults. Fertig's fighters even participated directly in offensive operations, attacking isolated garrisons, harassing supply lines, and capturing key terrain. Their familiarity with the terrain, local culture, and enemy habits gave them a unique role that conventional troops could not replicate. By the time the Japanese were finally forced back, Fertig's efforts had dramatically altered the course of the campaign. The liberation of Mindanao was faster, more efficient, and far less costly in terms of Allied lives than it might have been without local guerrilla support. Fertig had done what many had thought impossible. He had created an army from nothing, maintained it for years behind enemy lines, and shaped a critical military campaign from the shadows of the jungle. The story of Wendell Fertig is a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the extraordinary impact one determined individual can have. He showed that leadership is not just about rank or formal authority. It is about vision, determination, and the ability to inspire others to believe in a shared purpose. Under his command, ordinary soldiers, villagers, and escaped prisoners became a formidable force capable of resisting occupation and contributing to one of the most remarkable chapters of World War II. In the end, the jungles of Mindanao were not simply a place of survival. They had become a proving ground for a secret army, a symbol of defiance, and a critical part of the Allied return to the Philippines. Wendell Fertig's legacy endured long after the war, a reminder that courage, ingenuity, and unwavering determination can shape history even under the most impossible circumstances.